So this is swim leg number 22, making some progress here. I am joined this morning by arguably one of the most important collaborators to Noticeability. This is head of the Carroll School. This is Steve Wilkins. Thank you for taking this time.
Oh, pleasure.
I appreciate it. If you would, can you give us a bit about the history and the philosophy of Carroll?
Sure. Carroll School was founded almost 50 years ago as a bit of an experiment. Is there such a thing as a school that would work appropriately for children with dyslexia? And 50 years later, I think we know the answer is absolutely yes, there is such a thing. There is a way to help these children become really strong students. We're fascinated with what you're doing with Noticeability because we're looking now for curriculum that accentuates the superpowers within dyslexia. Yeah. And we know how to remediate the disability, we know how to teach children to read and be successful students, but we need a curriculum built into our program that accentuates their strengths. So it comes right out of the Dyslexic Advantage movement from Brock Eide, and we can't wait to get started with what you're up to this fall.
So, I mean, I am so grateful to hear that Carroll has proven over the last 5 decades that not only can this reading issue be addressed and resolved efficiently, which is in large part to Orton-Gillingham and that remedial reading process, but to just essentially, I mean, there are very few quote-unquote disabilities that can be addressed and then almost dissolved, not insofar as it's not an ongoing issue, because it always will be, but appropriately mitigated to the point where it is not necessarily the ongoing burden that one experiences early on.
Right. Cox's, the
Cox's.
two husband and wife you talked to, both dyslexic.
Oh yes.
Right, and I think he said, I was diagnosed by this guy. I think his name was Dr. Cole. Well, his name was Dr. Cole, Dr. Edwin Cole. He was a neurologist at Mass General Hospital. And the mythology on this one is Dr. Cole would meet a family whose child was struggling in school, do all these evaluations, and sit down with the parents and say, you know, what we have here is a very bright child who's motivated and well-behaved and is dyslexic. And back in the 1950s and 60s, the word dyslexia meant nothing. It was scary, perhaps. But he'd eventually work them through that to the place where they'd say, well, Dean and Sally, would you guys like to be part of starting a school for dyslexic children? And that's the mythology of how Carroll School started. He just found enough families who realized that typical schools were so inhospitable, to use your word, that they needed to start Carroll School.
No way.
And at that time, Dr. Cole had studied with Samuel Orton, who was a neurologist who kind of broke dyslexia wide open, started working with a woman named Anna Gillingham, and said, the brains are different. They are not. These are not slow or lazy or dumb kids. These kids' brains are different. That's what Orton knew. He found Gillingham to say, can you build a program to start to get these brains to function in a more typical way so that they can read? And so Orton-Gillingham from the 1930s was kind of the gold standard of how to help children who were dyslexic. Logically, when Carroll started in 1967, Orton-Gillingham was going to be the base of how we were going to help children learn to read. And it has remained that base for all 50 years. And the more neuroscience we understand about what's going on in the brain, the more Orton-Gillingham is brilliant, where you can actually start to identify different places in the brain where either that region or the circuit that connects that region need to be built stronger. Neuroplasticity is this big fancy word that says, as we learn, our brains change. And so an Orton-Gillingham style approach, or correctly the other day you used the Wilson reading method, would be another very reasonable approach. They literally are strengthening these pathways, these circuits in brain. So little dirt roads become stronger roads, become paved roads, become highways, become interstates, and that's what this method does. Is it literally rebuilds the circuitry in kids' brains.
It's amazing. And I'll tell you a funny story. Charlie and I got out of the water in a place called the Squidnocket Association, hosted by a woman named Emily Bramhall. And as we're coming out of the water, her mother comes down to the beach and says, there used to be a woman that I know. I don't know if she's alive still, but her name is Anna Gillingham. And she's been an island resident in her retirement years. And she was working a lot on dyslexia. I said, did you just say Gillingham? As in like Orton-Gillingham. I was like, that's just like saying, yeah, I knew a guy named, what's his name? Barack. Barack something, It's like, oh, I heard of
Washington.
him.
George, I think his name was.
That's and you know what I and this is where I'm going to reveal my own inadequate knowledge of OG, but how much does OG focus on the automaticity of certain sight words in order to alleviate the burden upon the working memory?
Yeah.
Is that a big part of it?
It's a beautiful question. Orton-Gillingham, in lots of mainstream educational environments, gets a bad name for being boring and bland and old-fashioned and really only about the decoding, the barking at print. You look at these squiggles on a page, you have to associate a sound with them, and then go, buh. And it's actually a really lousy description of Orton-Gillingham. Orton-Gillingham does exactly what you described when it's done properly. Because one of the things we know about reading is it starts in the back of the brain in the occipital lobe. And if the brain recognizes that squiggle as a letter, it activates certain circuitry. If it doesn't recognize that squiggle as a letter, thinks it's a number, thinks it's just a piece of artwork, it would activate differently. So it's really essential, this automaticity issue, to teach kids that when they see the symbol, that's a B. That circle with a stick on it is a B. It's not a P, it's not a D, it's not a Q, it's not a 6, it's not a 9, it's a B. And that has to be automatic. If it's not, it's just taking way too much brain energy. And then kids can't think the big thoughts. The superpower is crippled.
Yes.
And so when I trained in Orton-Gillingham, which is back in the 1970s, that automaticity piece wasn't as emphasized. But now, based on brain science, we know that's absolutely crucial. So that drilling, that automatic repetition is vital, so that then the whole brain, left and right hemispheres, can activate and think all sorts of big and beautiful thoughts.
There's, first of all, because both Sally, my wife, and I are dyslexic, and they say that approximately 100% of all dyslexic children, as a result of two dyslexic parents, wind up having dyslexia. I don't know if that's accurate. It's probably, but it's probably a high rate. Yeah. So we've been treating our son as dyslexic, and like I said in the car, he has displayed his dyslexia through his strength. Yeah. That's how I say, oh, he's definitely dyslexic.
I love that.
But one of the things that we do is, we do sight word automaticity, which is with all these flashcards, boom, boom, boom. And it's funny because other parents will see us if we're having a play date or something like that. And my fear is that they think that we're like that. Hey, we got to get into Harvard. Let's get these things automated. And I'm going, actually, it's not. It's not that. It's a totally different motivation. But and correct me if I'm wrong, but my explanation for the distinction between working memory, short-term, and long-term memory is that you imagine this funnel, and I'm ripping this off from everybody else in the field. I didn't come up with this, but this funnel, right, that takes in all the stimulus, and that stimulus can also be the phonetic decoding as a very significant stimulus, funnels in, drops out onto a very finite space called the working memory, which is essentially the workbench of the brain, and you are born with a certain bandwidth. There might be some neuroplasticity associated with that. You can expand or contract, but generally speaking, you're born with a bandwidth. And from that platform, things drop into the short and the long-term memory. So if I say 617, now take the 6 and put it after the 7, what is the sequence? That's your working memory. That's right. And then it goes into one of those two bins. Yeah. The problem that dyslexics face is that as we are trying to decode the word Gettysburg, just the name, is taking up all that bandwidth, so that what Lincoln was saying, or that is all lost because our bandwidth can't absorb it. Yeah. So by automating, you get certain words that just fall right through and don't have to take up that precious workbench space.
Right. You're right.
Yeah.
And
yes.
One of the things that is absolutely fascinating about this field is 20 years ago, we would have said that that working memory deficit that you have, that small desktop, that's your brain. That's your life, Dean.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
We'll teach you how to deal with it. We'll teach you how to accommodate it.
Yep.
Today, based on neuroscience, there's so much evidence that we can expand that workspace, that we can improve working memory, we can improve processing speed, we can improve reaction time, executive function, planning, and organization, that the brain works in such a way that if you do the right kinds of exercises that are tapping specific different parts of the brain, you are going to get a positive desired effect. So I think about it this way. In our parents' generation, if you were dyslexic, somehow somebody would find a way to either scuttle you out of the school system pretty darn fast and say, the world needs gas station attendants,
Yep.
Which turns out they actually don't.
Right. Yeah.
But you're a bright person, but you're not a school person. We'll just get you out of the system, or we'll run you through and give you a bunch of grades, and you'll get a diploma. In our generation, I think the educational system realized that's not really appropriate, and so we developed schools like Carroll. We developed public schools that had built-in accommodations, and we helped children be successful despite these underlying cognitive problems. Small working memory workbench. Today, for schools that are paying attention, the research is telling us you can expand that workbench. You can expand working memory. And so we've started doing that at Carroll, dedicated to Orton-Gillingham, dedicated to the tried and true, and simultaneously saying, I wonder if we can do away with some of these cognitive components that don't work very well, which created the reading problem. Now, Orton-Gillingham, I raise my hand in salute, is brilliant, but it's addressing the symptoms of dyslexia. What if you could go underneath and address the causes? And neuroscience is telling us increasingly that this is a promising pathway.
That's incredible. So all right. So one of the dyslexic superpowers is macro thinking and kind of future projection based on identified trends. So as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, the $10,000 question is this: fast forward 50 years, doubling the life of Carroll School. Do you see cognitive research blending with delivery, blending, and this is the biggest variable, the bureaucracy of public school systems? Mm-hmm. But could we imagine 50 years from now, some of what you are speaking about and that noticeability is working on becoming institutionalized so that we go from, in our lifetime, well, I don't know, will we both be alive? We'll both be alive in 50 years. Yeah, we'll be old, but we'll be alive. So going from a world where it was get them through to we're finding out to now we're embracing and actually accentuating the strengths of every student, especially those that have an inherent perceived disability.
Absolutely. Yes, you're insightful. Your macro super skill works. That's the vision. The vision is that all American children, all children worldwide, that schools would actually understand their cognitive profiles or their learning profiles. How does this child learn? And I actually am a really good example. I'm not dyslexic, but as I look at myself as a learner, there are some deficits in my profile that if somebody in these mainstream schools I went to had said, you know what, Steve, we're going to work on your visual spatial memory. I would have been a much better math student. I would have liked math better. I would have done better. I would have been happier. That this isn't just a recipe for the dyslexic children. This would be a recipe for all children. Understand the learning profile. And then school exerts its efforts on improving the parts that don't work, simultaneously with all that noticeability is doing, which is let's accentuate the parts that are spectacular as well. And that's what school is. School shouldn't be just running through a prescribed curriculum. It should be, how does Dean Bragnier's brain work? And let's take those parts that are brilliant and boom, noticeability. And let's take the parts that don't work and expand the workbench and improve the processing speed. And I think that's, it sounds like Brave New World. I think it's very possible. At Carroll, we're staying so connected to the neuroscience community so that I don't get all starry-eyed and naive about what's possible. Stay really connected to people like John Gabrielli at MIT to go, are we on track here? Is the kind of vision that we have, is that realistic? And he's such a great scientist. He's saying, well, the evidence isn't there yet, but this is such a promising path forward.
And I've met John. I think the world of John. John is in Wikipedia under the word neuroscience. That is John. And what I love is that for John to speculate is as much professional liberty as he can have while still maintaining his fiduciary duty to science. So that is like, I'm not explaining it correctly, but to hear John speculate on what you've just described is so affirming to me because he can't speculate until he has evidence, but to strongly suspect is really encouraging.
Yeah, no, that's right. He's got a beautiful way of saying, you realize there is zero evidence that this is possible. But from a neurologist perspective, a neuroscience, cognitive scientist perspective, it's really encouraging, promising. And Carol School, go, go, go. Keep pursuing this research because it sounds right.
And that's what we need, is we need technique blended with evidence, blended with then the result, which is anecdotal, which is people saying, yes, your experiment, as me, as a young dyslexic student, I have mastered X, Y, and Z, which was your intention. So you get this trifecta, which then all of a sudden is irrefutable.
You just said it exactly right. Let's take Orton-Gillingham, because we know that these children need to develop some fundamental skills so they can be successful in traditional kinds of schools. They need to be able to read. 2, take noticeability and the dyslexic advantage and make sure that every day they have something that they just feel like superheroes. They feel like stars. I wake up in the morning because I get to go build something in the MakerBot lab. And then 3, let's see if we can diminish some of the causes, the negative causes, the slow processing speed, the bad working memory, and see if we can diminish those. And that's the trifecta. That's exactly right.
Man, if I wasn't inspired before I sat down, I certainly am now. I'm so, I mean, look, we're so fortunate to be in this day and age, to be in Boston, Massachusetts, which is, the nucleus of fascinating research and experimentation in education. And I am this, this small and humble servant who feels totally indentured to a population that has been dismissed, and indentured's not the right word. I feel obligated to younger versions of myself, my son, people that you work with every day, because I've never seen a more investable population, meaning with the proper care and attention, not only can they self-actualize, but beyond that, they can help remedy so many of the ills that I think our society can't figure out yet.
Yeah, exactly. And so here's a funny little story about you and Carol's students. So in the summer, we have a summer school program, and I heard these 2 little kids, probably 2nd or 3rd graders, saying, yeah, there's this dyslexic guy swimming around the world.
Yes! Superpower!
And the other kid goes, huh.
Swimming around the world.
Completely accepted this. I think what you're doing to bring awareness to the issue of dyslexia and the positive side of all this is going to be life-changing for so many human beings. There are other organizations that are committed to the research, that are committed to teacher training, that are committed to schools like Carol School. But I don't know anybody else who's brought more enthusiasm and more energy and a bigger vision than you have brought. So I'm delighted to be talking to you.
I'm so humbled and so grateful to call Carol School, a collaborator and quite honestly a visionary in the field. And I'm just swimming to catch up.
Swimming around the world.
Apropos, swimming around the world.